Morning, Shavua Tov, welcome. This week is the Parsha of Bo. Today we'll be exploring the mitzvah, which is a very famous and fundamental mitzvah that Jewish men practice every single day. That is the mitzvah of Tefillin, which is discussed at the end of the Parsha. As we know that the Tefillin, they entail within them, there's the two components to the Tefillin. There's the Tefillin that we wrap on the hand, that's known as the Tefillin Shal Yad, and there's the Tefillin that we place on the head, which is the Tefillin Shal Rosh. And in these Tefillins, they contain within them, they're black boxes, which within them, they contain the Parshiot, special passages from the Torah, 4 passages to be precise. And they are the Parsha, the passage that contains the Shema, which is found in the Parsha of Va'eschanan. There's the Parsha of Vahoya im Shemoa, the second passage which we read in the Shema. And then there are 2 other passages which we are discussed in the end of this week's Parsha of Bo. That is the Parsha of Vahoya of Kadesh, which discusses about the firstborn, the mitzvah of redeeming the firstborn, and Vahoya Kiviyacha. Subsequently, there's another passage which talks about the redeeming the firstborn donkey, and in these Parshiot, it mentions the command to lay the tefillin. The tefillin on the hand and the tefillin on the head. Now, there's a difference between the tefillin shal yad and the tefillin shal rosh, and that is that in the tefillin that we put on the hand, it is one box with one compartment. Within it, it contains all 4 scrolls wrapped up, and they are placed in the all 4 parshiot are together, and they are placed inside the box. Whereas the Tefillin Shal Rosh, you have 4 separate scrolls. That are in 4 separate compartments in the Tefillin Shal Rosh, and you could see also how when you look on the outside, you could notice the difference between the hand tefillin and the head tefillin. So over there are 4 separate compartments, and in each compartment there is a separate scroll which has the separate parsha of Shema, V'hayim Shemoa, Kadesh, and V'haya Kiviyacha. Now, there's a discussion precisely when the Jewish people actually began to put on the tefillin, because at the end of this week's Parsha of Bo, the time is the 15th of Nisan, when Moshe Rabbeinu is conveying to the Jewish people about the time that they're going to be leaving the land of Egypt, and they should begin to always discuss and remember this amazing miracle, this Exodus, and there's the command to put on the tefillin. So it would seem that at this point there was the command to put on tefillin every single day. However, as we mentioned, since there are 4 scrolls, there are 4 passages in the Torah that discuss the tefillin, at this point there's only 2 sections. There are only 2 passages that are mentioned in this week's Parsha. However, the other 2, the Shema and V'hayim Shemoa, are found in Va'eschanan and Ekev, which were transcribed 40 years later. At the end of their traveling through the desert, and as they're about to enter Eretz Yisrael, at this point, the Shema and V'hayim Shemoa appear in the Torah. So the question is, when precisely did the Jewish people begin to put on the tefillin? So one opinion says that the truth is Hashem gave over, they heard all 4 parshiot already when they were in Egypt, and they began putting on tefillin at that time. It is merely that the latter 2 parshiot of Shema and V'hayim Shemoa were merely transcribed in the Mishnah Torah 40 years later, but already at the outset, 40 years earlier, when they were in Egypt, they heard the Parshiot and they put on the Tefillin. Second opinion says no. The Parshiot were only conveyed and transmitted many years later, and thus they only began to put on the Tefillin at the end of their journey before they entered Israel, as the Talmud in Kedushin says that it was because of the mitzvah of Tefillin that it was in that merit that they entered Eretz Yisrael. But the Rebbe has an interesting perspective on Rashi, and some others also have the same opinion, that Rashi is of the opinion, at least in the literal understanding of the Torah, that when the Jewish people heard the two parshiot in this week's parsha of Kadesh and V'haya Kiviyacha, so at that point they made the Tefillin Sharosh with 4 compartments, and only 2 of them had parshiot in them, and the other 2 compartments remained empty for 40 years. And at the end of the 40 years, when they heard the parshiot of Shema and V'hayim Shema, then they put it in. So they began to put on Tefillin, but it was half empty. And at the later point, they were able to insert the other 2. In any case, there's the mitzvah of Tefillin was at least as mentioned in this week's parsha, and we see a few interesting points in all of this. And that is, number one, we need to understand what's the significance of 2 tefillin that we put on every day. That is to say, there is the hand tefillin and then there's the head tefillin. Why is that necessary? Seemingly one should be enough. What is the function, what is the role of both parts, of both components of the tefillin? And further, according to halacha, it is customary to make 2 separate brachos. The hand tefillin and the head tefillin have 2 completely different brachos. The hand tefillin, there's a bracha, asher kitshanu b'mitzvos v'tzivonu lahaniach tefillin. We make the blessing to put on the tefillin. The head tefillin has its own blessing, asher kitshanu b'mitzvos v'tzivonu al mitzvos tefillin, which, according to the Ashkenazim, they actually make 2 separate blessings. The Sephardim, and our custom as well, is that you put on the hand tefillin and you make the bracha lahaniach tefillin, which exempts the head tefillin, but that's only on the condition that there is no talking, there is no interruption between the putting on the hand tefillin and the head tefillin. Whereas if a person were to interrupt in any way, then they would make a second blessing on the head tefillin, al mitzvahs tefillin. Now, this is a very, very interesting and very unique situation, because generally speaking, anytime we have a mitzvah which has various components to it, they don't each have their own individual, unique bracha. For example, when we shake lulav and esrog, there are 4 components, there are 4 ingredients in this mitzvah. You have the lulav, you have the esrog, you have the hadassim, the aravos, and yet we don't make 4 different blessings. We don't make a blessing on the lulav, a blessing on the esrog, on the hadassim, or the aravos. If we light the candles on Hanukkah, on the 8th day, you have 8 candles, you make 1 blessing, l'hadlik ner Hanukkah, and that's it. When it comes to the lulav, we make a 1 bracha on the lulav, and that is 1 all-encompassing bracha for the entire mitzvah. And yet, when it comes to tefillin, we make a blessing, or let's say it comes to Pesach. So indeed, by the Seder, we have 2 separate blessings, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, al achilas matzah. But first of all, it's the blessing on the mitzvah of the matzah is al achilas matzah. The bracha of hamotzi is merely because we're eating bread. It's not something that's unique and individual to the mitzvah per se. And we actually have 3 matzahs, our custom is to have, and that 3rd one doesn't have its own unique blessing either. So why was it established by the tefillin that the hand and the head have 2 separate individual, why do they have 2 separate blessings? In fact, they seem to have the same purpose, the same common goal, and that is the Torah tells us we put on the tefillin. It's to remind us, this is supposed to be a sign and a reminder that we left Mitzrayim. So if they have both have the same objective, why do they have each two separate blessings? And in general, the very mitzvah that we make on the head tefillin seems to be very unique, and that is, so the hand tefillin is lahaniach tefillin. Okay, that's fine. We're putting on the tefillin. We'll get to that bracha in a second, but talking about the head tefillin, al mitzvahs tefillin, seemingly is very, very general and vague. When we make a blessing, typically the blessing is action oriented. If you think about all the mitzvahs that we make a blessing on, whether it comes to shofar, l'shmoa kol shofar, there's the mitzvah, there's some action here. There's someone blows the shofar and we listen to it. There, the mitzvah is not to blow the shofar, the mitzvah is to hear the shofar, so we make l'shmoa kol shofar, but it's not al mitzvah shofar. We get very specific to listen to the sound of the shofar. Or if it comes to the sukkah, leishev basukkah, we don't just say al mitzvah sukkah, we say to sit in the sukkah. Al mikra megillah, there's the reciting of the megillah. Al achilas matzah, each mitzvah that we make a blessing is action oriented. Whereas over here, when it comes to the tefillin, it's al mitzvahs tefillin. It's very general, vague regards to the mitzvah. Now, when it comes to the hand tefillin, we say asher kichanu mitzvosav etzivanu lahaniach tefillin. Now, the Torah, the wording of the Torah, when it talks about the mitzvah of laying the tefillin on the arm, it says ukshartem le'osal yedacha. You should tie. Over here, the blessing is not al kshiras likshor tefillin. It's lahaniach tefillin. So we'll address perhaps that later. According to some opinions, the ukshartem is referring to not merely when we tie the tefillin, when we lay it on the arm, but earlier when we make the knot during the fashioning of the tefillin. Perhaps we'll address that later. But we need to understand all of this. It seems to be there's something very unique, of course, especially in the Chabad tradition. The tefillin campaigns have a very, very unique and special place. The Rebbe really promoted this around in the 1960s in the context of the 6-Day War, and tefillin has always been something really synonymous. The Chabad boys, they go out there and they're always getting people to put on tefillin, and there's something very, very powerful and unique, and we'll talk about some of those themes later on. But certainly we need to understand that the mitzvah of tefillin, there's two components, and there's something going on beneath all of this. So the truth is, the Rebbe explains, if we read, as we mentioned before, in the wording of the Torah, when it comes to when it describes the mitzvah of tefillin, when it mentions the tefillin that we lay on the arm and the tefillin on the head, there are two different descriptions. The Torah says ukshartem le'osal yadecha v'hayu letotafos beinenecha. So when talking about the arm tefillin, it says ukshartem le'osal yadecha. You should tie onto your arm as a sign. The tefillin should be tied onto the arm. When it discusses the sharosh, the head tefillin, it says v'hayu letotafos beinenecha. They shall be as a totafos. Well, that's another thing, exactly what the totafos. But let's generally say it's discussing it talks about there's a sign that we have on our head. V'hayu letotafos beinenecha. They shall be. In other words, we could already glean from the Torah's description of the mitzvah that there's something different going on between the tefillin shel yad and the tefillin shel rosh. In fact, the Rebbe quotes a very famous personality in the halachic world and commentator on the Torah. His name was Rabbi Yosef Rosen. He was the Gaon, he was the genius of Rogatchow. And he had a very, very original and penetrating way of analyzing, and had the Torah laws and ideas, a very, very original methodology. Oftentimes, you would look at a mitzvah or some other area in halacha, and he would analyze it using very original philosophic constructs. And in this instance, to give an example, he says when we put on the tefillin, we could look at it from two perspectives. What is the main mitzvah? What is the objective here? Is the objective to put on the tefillin, or is the objective that the tefillin should be on? In other words, and he sees this in the wording. We see this in the wording of the Torah. The Torah says, "Ukshartem lo seidecha." You should put on the tefillin onto your arm. Whereas when it talks about the shel rosh, the head tefillin, it says v'hayu. It should be. So when you put on a dress or you put on your jacket, right? There's two aspects of it here. There's the putting on your clothes, and then afterwards the clothes are on you. Now, it may seem like what's the difference? This seems like semantics. But there's actually halachic ramifications as to how we understand the definition of the mitzvah. So, for example, we know that the mitzvah of putting on tefillin is during the day. If a person puts on tefillin during the nighttime, they don't fulfill their obligation. Now, let's say a person put on the tefillin prior to the halachic time when a person is allowed to put on tefillin. So, a person has to, the mitzvah start, it's possible you can put on the tefillin, let's say from sunrise. Now, let's say it happens to be one day, it's 6:45 or 7 o'clock in the morning. Let's say a person either didn't know or mistaken with the time, put it on 20 minutes earlier, put on the tefillin. And then they were davening, and they had the tefillin on past the time. So they wore it from 6:30 till 7:30. So they wore the tefillin partially during the time that is the mitzvah of tefillin, and partially prior to that. So now the question is, did you fulfill the obligation? Now you're going to say, hang on a second. This person wore the tefillin for at least a half hour during the time that there's the mitzvah. So what I'll say to that is, hang on a second. What exactly, precisely, is the mitzvah of tefillin? If the mitzvah is that the tefillin should be on to wear the tefillin, yeah, you're right. This person wore the tefillin for a half hour during the time of the mitzvah. However, if you're going to say that the mitzvah is to put on the tefillin, right? So now, when you put on the tefillin, it was not the halachically mandated time. So when you put on the tefillin, it was during the night. So now you have the tefillin on for a half hour, but you never actually put on the tefillin in a time that there's a mitzvah. So you would have to do something. If it's at 7 o'clock and then you realize you put it on early, you would have to take the tefillin, move them around, adjust them, which would be considered as a reenactment of the laying of the tefillin for it to be considered permissible, to be considered that you fulfilled the mitzvah. In any case, we can already see a major distinction. From a halachic perspective, once we understand what the definition of the mitzvah is, it actually has a very powerful practical ramification. It is the mitzvah to put on the tefillin, is the mitzvah that the tefillin should be on. So what Rabbi Yosef Rosen is telling us here is that when we look at the tefillin, we could see two possibilities. There's the putting on, and then there is that it should be on. It should be worn. And this idea, this approach, you could look at a lot of mitzvahs in many ways. In other mitzvahs, sometimes one of them is true. Sometimes it actually encompasses both of these components, both of these approaches. But today we're going to talk about the tefillin. And he says, the truth is, these two understandings as to what the nature of the mitzvah of tefillin is, are actually the difference between the shel rosh and the shel yad. The arm tefillin and the head tefillin, actually, they are two very, very different mitzvahs. And that's why when the Torah says, "Ukashartem lo soidecha," you should tie the tefillin on your arm, the mitzvah of the hand tefillin is to put it on, to tie it. The mitzvah of the head tefillin is v'hayu, they should be. There's a mitzvah that the tefillin should be on your head. They should be worn as much as possible. And this is a very, very, and this would, first of all, number one, explain why there's two different tefillins. There's the arm tefillin and the head tefillin, because each one has its own function and its own objective, as we'll soon discuss from a spiritual and a philosophical perspective, what exactly each one is trying to accomplish. But it's first important to establish that each one has its own function. And that is also, we're soon going to explain, that the hand tefillin, all four parshiot, are in one box. When it comes to the head tefillin, they're in four separate compartments because due to the fact that there are two very, very different mitzvahs, each one has its own objective, and therefore the head tefillin has four compartments and the hand tefillin has one, as we will soon discuss. This is also true from a halachic perspective. There are two separate mitzvahs to the extent, let's say a person is unable to put on both parts of the tefillin. So, for example, either a person only has a shel rosh, or a person only has the shel yad, or a person injured their arm that they can't put on the tefillin on the arm, they injured their head, they can't put the tefillin on their head. Halachically, the one does not hold back the other. That is to say, if you only have one, you put on one. In some mitzvahs, if all four are part of part of the mitzvah, if you're missing one, then the whole mitzvah is missing, is lacking. Whereas here, each one has its own purpose, its own function, and therefore you should engage in each one, even if you don't have the other. So, what is the meaning of all of this? What is the purpose? What is the role of the tefillin shel yad? And what is the role of tefillin shel rosh? Now, the fact that we say that there's a mitzvah that the tefillin should be on your head, it may sound, okay, that sounds nice, that tefillin should be on your head. But we know that historically, the mitzvah of putting on tefillin wasn't just something that people went to the shul in the morning, they would put on the tefillin, and then they would go home, they would remove them and go about their business. Historically, tefillin were something that people wore the entire day. They had tefillin on from the morning till the night. One of the reasons today we don't have the tefillin on the whole time is because there are many, many laws concerning tefillin, such as purity of the body, purity of the mind, and today we don't have the faculties, the discipline that our ancestors had, and therefore we don't wear the tefillin the entire day. We are only able to have that discipline for the duration of our morning prayers, and therefore we remove the tefillin. Because today, wearing the tefillin the entire time, going about all of your business, to be able to continue to maintain the respect and dignity of the tefillin, it has become very, very difficult. So as opposed to doing all of that and disrespecting and treating the tefillin with the lack of honor that it deserves, we relegate the laying of the tefillin for a small portion of the day. Now, we see a fascinating story. There was this rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer, who was once invited by a very wealthy person to come and he had in his home a mikvah, which wasn't very, very common, a very special mikvah. He was was very clean, there was spring water over there, and he invited him to come use it. So it discusses how this rabbi comes and he removes his tefillin and his clothes and he goes into the mikvah. And then this wealthy person says, Rabbi, right over there, just it was only a few feet away, I have another mikvah that's even cleaner and nicer. I think you should try that one. So the rabbi, he emerges from the mikvah, he gets dressed, he puts his tefillin back on. He walks literally 6 feet. And then he removes his clothes, he removes his tefillin, he removes his clothes to go back into the other mikvah. And what the story illustrates is that this rabbi wouldn't even walk the 4 amot, wouldn't even walk the few feet without the tefillin. That's how it was in those days. So when we mentioned this idea that there's a mitzvah that the tefillin should be worn, in the what we call the olden days, that meant literally the entire day tefillin were worn. In any case, what is the significance of tefillin? What is it all about? So we know that the tefillin that we lay on the arm is placed in its position such that it is parallel to the heart, and the tefillin that we put on the head is in between the eyes, as the Torah says, "V'hayu l'totafos beinenecha." So, in other words, the significance of the tefillin shel yad that we put on the arm is somehow related to the heart, the seat of emotions, and the head tefillin on the head is associated with the intellect, with our mind. Now, what does this mean? The heart, the seat of emotions, is something that we all struggle with. Whether it is the impulses and desires that we all have, constantly being bombarded and badgered with all temptations that the world has to offer. And also, in general, the heart is the place where all anxiety, it's the place where all of our worries and burdens, we always have something that we're nervous about, we're worried about, what's going to be. And especially in these times when there's so much uncertainty. People like predictability, they like the pattern, they like the routine and the schedule. And when things are uncertain, they're very, very nervous. They're very worried what's going to be. There's no predictability at all. And therefore, it is very, very challenging to live a life that person is in a state of serenity, in a state of calm and confidence. And when we don't have that confidence in life, it inhibits our ability to be productive, both in our careers, in our relationships. And therefore, at the outset of every single day, we need to figure out how can we tame our emotions, our challenge, our emotional and psychological struggles that we go through. So, the Torah tells us, "Ukshartem le'osal yadecha." You put the tefillin on your arm, which is parallel to the heart, because the truth is, we cannot stop our heart. That is to say, the emotions, the feelings that we have are part of who we are. And it is impossible for a person not to feel the feelings that they have. It's natural. The only thing that you could do is ukshartem. You could merely tie it. That is to say, you could only, when it comes to a time that we feel something that's making us feel uneasy, worried, or in the other challenges that we deal with in life in terms of our desires and temptations, the only thing that we could do is that on a practical level, we could ensure that these desires or worries don't impact us on a pragmatic level. We could ensure that these feelings don't translate into action. Uksharta, it means on a tangible, practical level, we don't allow those feelings to filter into reality. We can't stop those emotions from being triggered because that's who we are. But we could put a filter on it. We could stop it from coming into our day-to-day life. That's the purpose of the arm tefillin. However, okay, so you stop it from coming into reality. But that's a one-off thing. You're constantly being bombarded. There's this barrage of feelings and emotions, and it's not a sustainable way to live. So the Torah tells us, in addition to the tefillin that we put on the yad, there's also the tefillin shel rosh. The tefillin shel rosh, here, the objective is to establish our mastery and self-discipline of our mind, of our intellect. Because maybe we can't control the way we feel, but we can control the thoughts that we have. Yes, we are constantly streaming thoughts, and we can't stop a negative thought from appearing. What we can do is that once we are presented with our mind presents a thought, we could decide whether we invite it or we reject it. It is the second thought. Once that thought comes into your mind, what do you do with it? Do you let it stay? Do you let it become a guest in your home? Or do you reject it? Do you push it away? It's like a person who is on their computer and all of a sudden they get these advertisement, these pop-ups, right? So if you're a computer somewhat, if you're savvy and you're knowledgeable in computers, you could figure out a way to disable and put up firewalls and on the back end to ensure that you don't get these advertisements and these pop-ups. But let's say you don't know how to do that. You can't stop necessarily these advertisements of popping up on your computer, but you don't have to click on them. You could close it. You find that X in the corner, and sometimes they hide it, but ultimately you find it. You are able to dismiss it. And that is within the realm of our ability to ensure that these thoughts don't take over, because we are in charge. The Rebbe once told the Chassid Rebbe Shmuel Lu from London, when he was a young lad, and he told the Rebbe about various issues that he had in life, and one of them was how to combat and deal with the struggles that in his mind he has all these thoughts and how to deal with them. And the Rebbe says, don't engage in a struggle. You have a thought, don't try to fight it, because that is a futile exercise. What you need to do is, if you have a thought that is not positive, is not productive, it's not healthy, what you should do is, instead of fighting that thought, think of another thought. Introduce another thought in your mind that's not connected to that one. Ideally, it should be a thought of Torah. If you can't muster something that you thought about or learned about recently, then let it be random. Think about the weather or some other thing, but don't try to fight that thought, because that's not something you can't fight that. However, you could decide where that thought is going to go. And this, the Torah says, is the key to success. Because when we wake up in the morning, we are very fragmented. Our thoughts are all over the place. And in order to have some sort of cohesion, to be able to align our feelings and our mind, that they should be synchronized to one objective, to one purpose, it is the Tefillin that introduce that stability, that serenity that is so important and so needed in today's day and age. There was once a professor whose name was Abraham Polachenko. He was involved in the computer industry, and in the 1960s, when computers and mainframes were slowly moving from the arena of where just scientists use, and they were applying it to businesses and whatnot. And he had a yechidus, an audience with the Rebbe, and he asks the Rebbe, he says, Rebbe, I know that everything that exists in this world, you say, can be found in the Torah. The Torah contains the key and the secret of everything. So tell me, where do we find in the Torah the concept of tefillin? And the Rebbe says, where do we find in the Torah the concept of computers? So the Rebbe said, it is the tefillin. And he said, what does that mean? He says, well, you walk into a room and you could see many, many gadgets. You could see a calculator, a radio, a TV, a typewriter, all different types of functions. And they all seem very different, disparate, and unrelated. However, you look on a computer and it's all integrated, it's all there. Because beneath all of it, there are these wires. There are these different electronic connections that are all there behind, like under the hood, so to speak. And over there, everything is all connected. So the Rebbe said the same thing is with a person. You have your mind, your thoughts. That's in one realm, that's in one arena. Then you have your emotions. Your emotions schlep you in another direction. And then you have action in the world of action. So everything is flying in different directions. And there is no unity, there's no cohesion. But that is what the tefillin are. You have the straps of the tefillin. Those are like the wires. You have the tefillin on the shel yad, you have the tefillin shel rosh. And what happens is when you put on the tefillin, these wires, so these spiritual wires, they allow the feelings that you have, the thoughts that you have, and in action, they all will propel you towards one unified purpose, one unified mission. So if you feel in the beginning that you're fragmented, you feel like you're all over the place, now, through putting on the tefillin, you are able to bring this all together. And that's why the Rebbe explains the difference between the tefillin shel yad and the tefillin shel rosh. The tefillin shel yad is one box, one compartment which contains all of the parshiot. The tefillin shel rosh have 4 compartments because the realm of emotion, there is no distinctions, there is no nuance to exactly how you feel. A person has their emotion. It's not limited to one case or one scenario. When it comes to the brain, when it comes to the intellect, that's the nature of intellect. It disseminates, it dismembers, it tries to break everything apart to understand it. And the way one person understands it and another person understands it, there's many levels. So we know even in the intellect, there's many levels. There is the chachma, bina, dat. You have the conception, comprehension, connection. There's many levels and layers to understanding. That's symbolized by the 4 compartments. So it would seem that the mind, a person who's intellectual, and a person who's an emotional, these are 2 separate realms. They don't speak to each other. Emotion is warm and on fire. Intellect is cold and abstract. And yet, it is through our ability to control our thoughts and to have that discipline, self-discipline and self-mastery, then we are able to guide. When we go through difficult times, we can choose based on our control of our intellect. The emotions automatically will follow suit. There was a chassid of the Maggid of Mizrich who came to the Maggid and said, Rebbe, I don't understand. When the Torah tells us not to do something, forbids us from engaging in certain behaviors, I understand how a person is in charge, could be commanded not to engage in certain behaviors. When it comes to action, you could abstain from doing certain things. And similarly, when the Torah forbids certain forms of speech, a person could choose not to speak. However, when the Torah says that you shouldn't harbor certain thoughts or emotions, that I struggle with, because how can the Torah command and expect a person not to think a certain thing or to feel a certain thing? These are natural feelings and thoughts. What does the Torah expect from us? So the Maggid says, I think you need to pay a visit to my disciple, Reb Wolf of Zhitomir, and I think he'll provide you some important insight into your question. So the chassid travels to Zhitomir, and he comes there. It's at night, in the winter. It's very cold, dark. And he notices that the home of Reb Wolf of Zhitomir, the light is on. So he approaches the home, and he sees that the rabbi is there. He's studying, and so he knocks on the door. Knocks, but there's no response. He knocks a little bit harder. He knows that the light is on. The rabbi is there. He's up and awake. But the rabbi seems to be oblivious to the fact that he's knocking on the door. He's knocking and louder and shouting. He's cold, but there's no response. Sitting there the entire night, banging and banging until he just gives up. In the morning, the rabbi comes to the door and he says, Shalom Aleichem, how are you? Welcome, come inside. And he's totally confused because here he was sitting there and he didn't answer the door. Now, all of a sudden he's becoming this warm host, and he offers him a glass of hot tea. And Shalom Aleichem, how you doing? What's going on? How's everything? How's the Rebbe? How are the Hasidim doing? And so he says, now tell me, what could I do for you? He says, well, to tell you the truth, I had a question for our Rebbe, the Maggid, and he sent me to you. What's your question? And he says, yeah, my question is about how can we establish self-control on our emotions and our thoughts. Seemingly we have no ability to curtail our feelings and emotions. It's beyond our control. And he sent me to you. So the rabbi says, well, I think I already I explained it to you. I demonstrated to you the answer. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, here you were coming to my home, and you were knocking on the door, and knocking and knocking and knocking. However, I did not answer. Did not answer the door. He said, because I am the owner of the home, and I decide who comes in and who doesn't come in. So the rabbi says, you are no less an owner of your thoughts and your emotions than you're an owner of your own home. Just like in your house, you decide who comes in, who doesn't come in. You should know that you are the balabas. You are in charge of your body, of your thoughts. And therefore, if a negative thought comes in, is introduced into your mind, you have the choice. You have the power to decide if this emotion, this thought will take over or not. And therefore, each and every one of us, the Tanya tells us this idea about moach shalad al halev, that we have the ability, even though science and doctors, they want to tell us that there is nature, there's nurture. At the end of the day, every person was given the power, and therefore we have the responsibility to take ownership over not just the things that we do, the things that we say, but even the thoughts that we have. If we work on it, it's very, very difficult, because naturally a person gravitates to that which is easiest. The person's body and desires and temptations are very, very powerful. However, when we work on it, the first time it may seem like climbing Mount Everest, but each time that we resist, we fight back, and we decide, when a certain feeling comes in, we decide, you know what? I'm not going to let this take over. I dedicate a moment to think about some Torah. And that's why it's very, very important for every single one of us to constantly be engaged in things higher, greater, deeper than just mundane living. We should always have some Torah study every single day, just a little bit if we don't have a lot of time. Constantly be engaged in Torah, because when it comes to these moments, we are able to hold on to something that we most recently learned, and that gives us the power and the strength. It propels us, it lifts us up from the quagmire, the crassness and the coarseness of this body that tries to constantly schlep us down. And therefore, if we're constantly engaged in Torah, Tefillah, words of prayer, that helps us in this struggle. And then, when these negative thoughts or feelings creep in, we are able to fight back, so to speak, with something positive, with a little bit of light, which dispels the darkness. And that is the secret of the Tefillin, each and every day. For men and for women, of course, they don't have the same challenges that men have, and they have their ways to be able to begin the day with establishing that you're in charge. Not let the day all this determine and program you what you have to do. Right away, you decide that you're establishing your ownership, your mastery over yourself. And then automatically the rest of the day will be a lot better for each and every one of us. You'll feel energized, you'll feel empowered. Not that you're just this victim, just going through the motions, but every single action you take, you feel like you're in charge. You're determining where your day is going, where your life is going. And therefore, the Torah tells us that, especially when they were leaving Mitzrayim, when they were slaves, they were constantly, at that point, a slave has no ownership over themselves or their time, what they're going to do. All the choices are made for them. Their master tells them when to wake up, what to do during the day, when to go to sleep. And it's easy because you don't have to make any choices and you don't have to take responsibility for the choices if they don't work out. But Hashem is telling them, when you come out of Mitzrayim, this is your freedom. And this is your opportunity to become a master over yourself over again. You need to reclaim your ownership over your body, over your lives, over your decisions that you make. And tefillin, that is going to be a very, very important ingredient. That's going to be a very, very important exercise in reclaiming yourself. When you meditate, Hashem in the Shema, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, you establish the true owner, the true balabayas of this world. And you dedicate and focus your mind and your heart to that purpose, to that mission. Then that is the beginning of the step of recovery, of rehabilitation for the Jews as slaves in those days. And today, which many of us have become or are slaves, at least part of the time, to the various devices and various cultural winds that are blowing in our times, it is our way of reasserting control over ourselves and our lives. So may it be Hashem's will that just like the mitzvah of tefillin then, when the Jewish people were leaving Mitzrayim, that was the beginning of the journey of redemption. Each and every one of us should experience that freedom from all of our troubles and travails and trials that we go through in life. We should be able to feel that we are in control of our lives. And through this, when we begin the personal liberation, the personal redemption, that leads to redemption on a collective scale, the coming of Mashiach, B'mheira v'yameinu, Amen.